Thank you. So we'll be kind of shifting gears a little bit back to the last session, and you might notice from your program that the title has truncated a little bit, mostly due to the fact that I have an obscene amount of slides and a very little time. So if you are interested in the investment aspect, I'm happy to walk you through my poster. So just to kind of orient you a little bit to what I'll be discussing today, a roadmap, I'll just kind of talk about some of my study goals, the phases of the study, methods, etc., and we'll talk about some conclusions and future directions. So with respect to goals, many of you probably share my frustration in this field. Oftentimes our goals are the building blocks of failure, not uncommon with Psi research. But let's just talk about what I wanted to do here. First of all, my personal aim was to have a kind of a first-person experiential approach, because I think most of us probably came into this field not only because Psi is implicitly cool, but it's also it's the experiential aspect. It's the phenomenology of it is unquestionably important, and for me that's the driving factor for being in this field. But also finding ways to try to quantify and objectify my own experience. So I wanted to be able to train myself to reliably produce PK effects on a physical object. And secondly, I wanted to develop a protocol that could be rolled out to future formal experiments with macro and micro PK kind of interleaved together. So I do want to use this to pause and just say that everything I'm doing here is completely like homegrown exploration with no real codified a priori hypotheses. So, let's not get too excited if the methods don't quite congruent to what you think would be appropriate in a laboratory context. What I'm hoping to do is to set up a framework that we can have a little bit more of a controlled study. Okay? And the third goal was to see if we can detect a reliable signature of macro PK or Psi more generally within a buried random signal. So just kind of an overview to get a bird's eye view of the low-hanging fruit. I'm using the method that we learned about earlier today, Sean McNamara's macro PK. So trying to produce effects large enough that would be observable by the naked eye. So luckily he saved me the time to have to go through this too much, but essentially we have a folded piece of foil balanced on a needle and a cork that's in a quasi-sealed glass chamber to minimize the influence of air currents, etc. I am using the same method. I did take some workshops with Sean, and I also read his book, which I found to be extremely helpful, and using this TrueRNG method that he described before as well. So just to give you an idea, unfortunately he didn't get to put any video, but I did. This is sped up 20 times. Notice the importance of having a cat helper with you. And you can see that we can definitely start to move the object and eventually start to pull your hands away from it. Sean and others are at the point where they don't even ever have their hands on the glass. So I'm fairly convinced that the macro effect is real and reproducible, that it's not just perturbations of the table, or et cetera, or convection effects, however. Cool. By the way, the picture that Sean put up with the little kid doing it, that's my son. So he took the learning curve for me that was several hours, and he was able to condense that into about 30 seconds for his first try. So as far as micro PK, I'm operationalizing this as the subtle effects of Psi on random systems. In this case, I'm using a random number generator that's essentially acting like an electronic coin flipper, right? And in this case, I'm collecting at 256 bits per second. And of course, with that, we'd have an expected outcome of roughly 128 ones and zeros. I do want to kind of talk about this just very briefly, because I know that we have a very mixed audience and not everyone appreciates the methods that go into this. And looking at these graphs are inherently very boring unless you kind of understand what it is you're looking at. So I'll just briefly touch on what this means. Essentially, for each second of data, we're calculating a z-score of the expected outcomes and basically squaring that z-score and then plotting it over time. And just we're plotting the accumulated squared z-scores, correcting for the degrees of freedom. And just to give you an orientation of how I'll be presenting these slides, when I have non-significant data, I'll plot it in blue, and when we have data that deviates above a threshold of P05, we'll apply that in green, just to kind of orient you. So just the study setup, as I mentioned, we have the foil object in glass. I generally start with a baseline where the object is just sitting there and I'm in the other room or in another part of the room doing some breathing meditation and just trying to get in the right mental frame of mind. And then these sessions were all self-timed between 20 or 40 minutes. I wasn't going to push it past my point of fatigue, and that could just vary from day to day. I was also simultaneously collecting random number generator data from a TrueRNG, as I mentioned, at 256. And importantly, the setup was more a field configuration in that there was no real-time feedback from the RNG. This was passively running in the background. I wasn't particularly interested in intending towards the reg. My focus was on the foil object. Also, I simultaneously collected video via HD webcam so that I have a synchronized timing between when the object was moving and what was happening in the random event generator. And this was all synced into MATLAB GUI, and as I mentioned, the analysis was basically following the basic kind of GCP protocol, assuming like one reg as opposed to a mini. I also had a marker channel built in my interface so I could kind of mark subjective key events as they happened. I also, during this time, I got several sync text messages, which I thought were kind of interesting, and I wanted to be able to indicate in time when I was getting those messages as well. Most of you are probably familiar with sync text, but for those of you who are not, sync text was an app that was put out by Celeron that was essentially a random event-generated messaging system that would send you random texts at random times that happen to be profound. And just to give you an example of what that would look like, in one particular instance, I had one of my cats desperately climbing on my leg for attention, wanting to be coddled and whatnot. But I was very busy looking at pictures of cats or something like that on my Facebook, on my phone, totally ignoring her, okay? And the sync text message comes up and it says, "Someone who adores you greatly is hidden right before your eyes." So in my experience, sync text is a really interesting way of getting these profound experiences that are also simultaneously very difficult to assign any kind of meaningful statistics to. But I just thought they were kind of interesting, so I thought I'd include it. So as far as some quality controls, I wanted to make sure I was working with a fair coin. And so with that, I established a baseline of basically 500 hours worth of simulated data, 500 sessions. And you can see the thresholds at P05 all the way up to 001. And in green, you'll see, as expected, a portion of those would be kind of like false alarms or false hits. And roughly you'd expect about 25 tests to run significant out of 500 by chance. I had 26. Of those, 6 were above P01, none were above P001. So, I was fairly convinced that the instrument I was using was a fair device. Okay, so in phase 1 was kind of my training. At this point, I'm just reading the book. I'd never actually moved the object, but I had everything set up, sans the video camera. So I did 6 training sessions. These were self-terminated, again, lasting 20 to 40 minutes. And again, no video, just the reg running in the background. So let's go through some results. My very first session, again, the object has never moved. I've never done this before, and I got this very encouraging result saying maybe there is a way of just detecting the efforts towards psi of a significant hit on the first run. But as we all know, those first results can be a little bit promising more than they deliver. So, what was very interesting though on this very first attempt, I got a sync text that said, "Experience is analog, perception is digital," which I thought was kind of interesting as I'm kind of interleaving a digital and analog mixture of my psi experiment here. But the second session didn't quite pan out. On the third session, though, however, I got an even stronger result than the first. But from 3, 4, and 5, again, we kind of returned back to just a normal random walks. I do want to mention on the 5th session, though, I took a little break. I was kind of getting a little frustrated. At this point, I've still never moved the object. I've got accumulated several hours behind with my hands on glass with really nothing to show for it. And I started to get pretty fatigued and tired and not really wanting to give up, but just a little bit out of sorts. And so I marked on my marker, which is that first purple line, that I was taking a break. And then a moment later, the sync text appeared, and it said, "As long as the mind gives up before the body, we're destined to be slaves in this world." Okay, so finally I had my 6th session, and again, nothing to write home about as far as the overall session data, but I don't know if you can kind of see this little interesting blip here. Something kind of abnormal in a sense as far as a deviation. And what happened here was my very first movement of the object, which I, of course, did not quite believe. I'm then now looking under my table if I bumped it or something like that. And if I were to just isolate that as if it was its own little event, it does deviate above the parabola for the moment there. So we'll come back to that. So at this point, we all did a workshop. I dragged several friends of mine, some of them are in this room, up to Garrett's lab at CU Boulder with Sean. You'll see on the right there that white piece of hair sticking out as the illustrious Garrett Modell. And we all did a group workshop, and we all found very great results from this. During the workshop, we had about seven attendees, about 2.5 hours, including a long break. 100% success rate, so every single person in the room was able to get some movement in the object. I also was collecting reg data, and this time we had Sean collecting video. It was timed with the reg. And so I was able to also mark the segments of video that had these key moments. So overall, the session, if I just take that whole 2.5 hours and put it as one session with breaks and stuff, it did not achieve significance, but there are some segments that I do want to point out. In this first one here was the beginning where we first placed the glass over the objects. So we started off just kind of playing with the object by itself, not really, having the glass yet, just to get a feel of things. We placed the glass, and you'll see that as soon as this happens and as soon as the group started kind of applying their intention towards the objects are starting to move and go all over the place. And up into the last part is where everyone kind of started laughing and checking out, and there was some disturbance in the field, and then it seemed to drop down. And I had to mark those 2 events. At one point, we were pausing, and Sean is talking about some of the psychological factors and individual kind of personal psychological constitutions that might affect these results. And again, we get a sync text, which says, "People are stupid, but you are people too." Kind of reminder not to get caught up in your own BS, basically. So if I just isolate that section where the glass, until people were laughing, we do have a significant result. And there again, at the end of the session, we have another kind of interesting peak where we started experimenting with a few other things. So this first part here, we'll say is FaceTime. Is everyone familiar with with FaceTime, the kind of messaging video conferencing app on your iPhone? We had a friend of mine, a martial arts teacher, very good with his energies, go out into the hallway where I held the camera up to the glass so that he could have a line of sight to the object, but he's in the other room, right? And we saw an interesting deviation at that point, which again was significant only if I isolate that episode, okay? We also experimented with putting a few objects in the glass and all working together on moving those objects. So we're working now as a team on one group of objects, and you see where the point where the glass was placed, and then going back through the video, I marked the point where people, like where actually one of my colleagues, like she just slumped forward like in exhaustion basically. And from that point, it seemed like the field effect was just over. Okay, and again, that was a significant moment. So this got me kind of thinking that, well, it'd be nice to have this at home with the camera set up so I can look at not only just the entire session with the reg, but also like what are these kind of key moments that were happening. Perhaps they can isolate just the movements, might be something interesting to look at, okay? So in the second phase, I call this kind of the test phase, where I had 15 test sessions with the same basic setup as phase 1, the training phase. But this time I'm also synchronizing the data with the video capture of the object in the glass. Okay? So not too awesome results with overall session data, and also not too surprising. I did not see any real interesting data in the regs. But I thought, well, maybe I can try to isolate just the movements and see perhaps if these things are really correlated, maybe when I isolate those movements, just like it was in the workshop, when there seems to be something really going on with the object, that's when I would see the reg data start to play around. So I created what I thought was a pretty clever little app in my MATLAB GUI interface. I created basically the equivalent of like a video reviewer. And I was able to mark the segments in the video, which were in and out points in the timeline, and then that would show me the ins and outs of the random data that was associated with that session. Make sense? So now this is isolated movements, just the movements when the object was moving, and we got 2 out of about 52 individual movements. So again, nothing too strong of a correlation between the movement of the physical object and the movement of the reg. Okay, so I don't think I pointed out with respect to my testing session. Once I was able to move the object that first time, I have not had a single failure. I was able to have 15 out of 15 sessions where I was able to move the foil object. Right. So there seem to be some definite practice effects, which I'll get into. But let's talk about the decline. One question that always comes up is the decline effect, and we definitely see maybe some indications of that in the reg data. With respect to the physical object, if I look at the proportion of total time of the session that the object was spent in motion, you kind of see this interesting graph here where after stage 4, after the 4th session, it seems to kind of decline for a bit. But this might be explained by some other factors, such as I was experimenting with other things like taking my hands off and never putting them on the glass, et cetera, which may take a little time longer to get the object moving. And the overall correlation, you can kind of see it also inclines back again after session 11. So overall, what I experienced was more of a practice effect. It seemed like I was able to keep the object in motion more if I was doing the same thing with my hands on the glass. Also, this is the amount of time it took before the first movement occurred. And you'll see there's kind of a blip there when I was experimenting, but overall, I was able to get the object moving pretty quickly. So some conclusions. I do think that the method that Sean endorses is highly trainable, replicable, and has a minimal learning curve. And as I mentioned, there's 15 out of 15 tests that I had some movement with intention. The evidence suggestive, at least, of a decline effect in the micro, and there might be likely practice effects in the macro, though. It seemed like the more I practiced, I was having better and better results over time. So my question was, can we detect a reliable signature of macro PK or psi more generally buried within the random data? And I would say not likely using the present methods. These things seem to be very resilient to p-values and traditional methods, such forth. And I started asking, is this really a signal to noise problem, or are we really dealing with a frame of reference problem? These micro effects, and especially when you think about how the sync text was working, they seem to track more with the profundity of the experience, the meaningfulness. Your first session where you're sitting down and you're starting a new regimen of meditation might be more meaningful in some sense than once the object's kind of moving and you can move it. It doesn't have that same kind of novelty that came up earlier, right? So some questions: is micro-PK is trainable as macro given the TrueRNG approach? So luckily I was able to put Herb and Sean together, and maybe we can work on experimenting with different means than just these, and cross-pollinating methods as far as meditation techniques, et cetera. And can a signature be identified with it, maybe like machine learning approaches, looking at the reg data? Maybe there's some kind of pattern within the data that's not so amenable just to the p-values, for example. So for future directions, I'll be looking at laboratory study with more a priori hypotheses defined, increased rigor, and pre-registration, of course. And I'd like to think about extending the current paradigm into like remote influencing that Sean talked about earlier. So just want to briefly acknowledge especially York and Roger for all of the patience while I was kind of pinging them over email and Facebook and really trying to hone down the methods. This is not by any means a tacit endorsement of these methods. Perhaps I got it wrong, and I'm sure I'll hear about that in a moment. But they were very, very helpful, and I do appreciate that. And also, of course, to Sean, who taught me this technique, who I think is doing a wonderful work, and I would highly recommend his book if you'd like to find out yourself how to do this. So, thank you. Is that a good sign or a bad sign?
Can you hear me?
We were having a little mini conversation here that maybe you've demonstrated that your cat is a very powerful wizard because it seems involved in multiple, with the sync text. And
yeah, this is definitely a potential confound. There's always there's the whole story about the meditator and the cat. You've heard this one? The monk and the cat, right? How's it go? The monk's cat's always bothering him when he meditates, so he ties the cat out outside, and now 5 generations later, the students think to go into the temple to meditate, you have to tie a cat outside. Yeah.
Could you talk a little bit more? It's on. Okay. Could you talk a little bit more about sync text? Because I'm assuming there's a number of pre-written messages that it's using. Is that correct?
It's probably appropriate to talk about it in the past tense, unfortunately, but I hear there's some good things on the horizon. So it was configurable. It did offer several palettes of potential texts. The one that I started off with the cat that you saw was actually a fortune cookie set. But then I started playing around with aphorisms or different quotes or things that had come to me in different periods that I felt like really that were insightful or profound. So they were almost kind of like messages for myself. It did make me wonder, though, if with a larger palette of potential questions, if it could get a little bit more specific, because if you have a limited palette, there's only so many things that it could tell you. But I thought some of them were kind of interesting that they still seemed to match with subjectively what was happening at the time.
Right. Okay,
Yeah.
Thank you.
Really fast. I don't think we've told you about this, but we did a study a number of years ago where we set our sync text messages that were like 1 through 7. The dog is sleeping.
Yeah,
the dog is
Mark
eating.
told me a little bit about that.
Okay, and then
yeah.
we videotaped our dog 24 hours a day, and we matched the sync text to the rating on the video, and it matched.
That's
So
awesome.
the sync text liked our dog.
Yeah, that's awesome. And so it is kind of neat that there may be ways to kind of pin a statistic to it. But it's also kind of interesting about some of these effects, how what we find the most profound in life is really hard to quantify in any meaningful way to someone else. And that's another reason why I really strongly advocate the first-person approach, is that you can't necessarily convey an experience with methodology or statistics. And data tends to be a very thoroughly unconvincing medium to communicate these things, as we all have been struggling with for many of you your entire careers, right? But if we could get more people having their own firsthand experience, I think it's better, A, number one, for understanding the underlying phenomenology, but B, then you don't have to convince them. Now let's take this forward, because I think we got to get well past the point of proving or establishing the baseline that this is real, and now let's think about like how do we use it, which I think is great why we came to the conference with the theme of applied. Let's take this out and let's do something with it. So, yeah, Morris.
David, I may have misunderstood, but did you say that there was a decline effect in the micro PK but not the macro PK?
I said it was suggestive of a decline effect. I don't think I have enough data to put a stake in the ground there, because those first, I only had two significant sessions out of the whole batch. So, yeah.
But the real question is, if that's correct, how would you explain a decline effect in one type of PK but not the other, if they're happening at the same time? So
it might go to our understanding of what the micro PK is actually picking up on within the context of this experiment, or within, like let's say the Global Consciousness Project, et cetera. It may not be tracking psi in this context because it's running in the background. It's not like I was hoping to have a psi detector, like something I could get reverse inference from, like maybe it rings a bell, like, hey, something's happening that's deviating. That would be great. But it seems instead to be like the profundity or the meaningfulness, right? And so as I was getting more and more capable of moving the physical object, my emotional state's more of a baseline. I'm not having this like, aha, eureka, I just moved the thing for the first time, I can't believe I can do PK experience. I was having like, let's sit down, let's practice our little thing, and let's collect some data. And so perhaps the micro is really more responding to that emotionality or something more richer or meaningful at a different layer. That's why I said I don't know that the way we're looking at it as a signal to noise problem is really the answer. It might need a frame of reference problem. And the frame of reference, when you think of like what's guiding my life course, some of these synchronicities or these big moments are meaningful and are more powerful at a higher frame of reference. It's not just this like day-to-day embodied 3D fluctuations that we're picking up on. I don't know if that makes sense, but I'm happy to talk more later. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.